You know, I've said it before and I'll say it again, I'm not necessarily brand loyal to any one particular console or platform. I just want to play games that interest me. I've had various points where I've been a big fan of Nintendo, I've had various points where I've been a big fan of PlayStation. I acknowledge PC gaming as the best overall choice as far as optimally experiencing your games, even if it isn't my first choice all the time. As you can tell though, I've traditionally steered more into the PlayStation direction over the years. It's what I grew up with, and of the big three, I vibe with PlayStation exclusives more than those of Nintendo or Xbox, back when Xbox had exclusives. Obviously, people are well aware of the fact that I'm a big God of War fan, it's my favorite game franchise, and I've also been known for my coverage of Twisted Metal, and among other things, I'm also a big fan of Infamous, the Ghost of games, Ratchet & Clank, the list goes on. With that said, there's absolutely no doubt that the whole PlayStation has no games meme that's been going on for ages does ring true somewhat, despite the fact that console exclusives have traditionally been the thing that sold consoles over the years. The PS5 only has a small handful of them, which doesn't appear to be changing anytime soon. Recently, it was announced that Sony was going to be shutting down BluePoint games only a couple of years after acquiring them, which really upset me personally. Sure, they're only best known for making remasters/remakes of existing games, but that's been their job and they've done it incredibly well. To hear that they got shut down after doing basically nothing post-acquirement was sad. In fact, I was baffled more than anything because I questioned what was even the point of acquiring them if they were going to be shutting them down so soon. But then I got to thinking and started asking, what were they even doing for the past couple of years? Because I had heard a while ago that BluePoint Games were working on a game for a while, apparently an original game. And I decided to look more into it and was surprised to find that, of all things, it was a God of War live service game. A game which was cancelled just a few weeks before the studio got shut down. Now, I'll speak in a moment about how much of a baffling f***ing decision that is, but after looking into this, it struck me. Didn't I hear of at least 2 separate other live service games by different developers also getting cancelled? I decided to do some digging, and I found something quite illuminating because I didn't know the half of it. Now, generally, I live in a perpetual state of dilligaff and tend not to keep up with a lot of gaming news because I have better things to worry about. So this is probably old news to some of you, but to me it was such an eye-opening revelation that I felt I had to talk about it, because it made a lot of things suddenly make a lot of sense. There weren't 3 PlayStation Live service games that were cancelled, not 4, not 5, but 7. Or possibly 6, the number is a bit screwy because of various mixed reports. But either way, no matter how many got cancelled, a bunch got cancelled, and there are a few more whose fates are unknown. And I could not believe that half of those games were even a thing. Aside from the aforementioned God of War, a live service game by BluePoint Games, as well as The Last of Us, a live service game that was being made by Naughty Dog, you had such riveting ideas as a Spider-Man live service game by Insomniac Games, a Twisted Metal live service game by Firesprite, an unknown project by Bend Studio, a studio which hasn't finished anything since the surprisingly successful Days Gone. Apparently that's Sony's idea of following up. Then you had several more that weren't tied to specific established IP. Several of these were only vaguely hinted at, without any specifics of their existence leaking other than vague details, and I decided to dive into this rabbit hole to explore what the hell had been going on for the past few years that led to this philosophy which made Sony want to start trying to make 12 live service games, as well as what led to the cancellations of all these various games. I mean, I probably don't even need to say what caused all the cancellations, but yeah, we'll get to that. Apparently this goes back to an announcement in 2022 when Jim Ryan announced that these 12 live service games were in development. Let me be clear, I have contempt for Jim Ryan, but I don't hate him as a person because I don't know him. I mean, as much contempt as he earned, apparently he was the one pushing for PlayStation Studios games to come out for PC, so as somebody who wants my favorite games to be played by everyone, I don't know what to think. With that said, I know for an absolute fact that the decision to make all these live service games goes back several years before 2022 and also involved a lot of other dumbass faceless executives you've probably never heard of, and it was a dumb decision by every single one of them, including Jim. Either way, apparently this was an attempt to refocus their business strategy, an attempt at a new chapter in PlayStation's history. It's plain to see that in hindsight, that this was an absolute brain-dead decision. Because how many games have come out for the PS5 right now that qualify as high-level exclusives that aren't ports or remasters? To make it trickier, games that also didn't have a PS4 port. But let's also include ground-up remakes, since those are pretty much whole new games. And I'll include those that eventually came out for PC. What, around 10? Meanwhile, the PS4 had like 30. It's also noted in some press releases that when these developers were instructed to make live service games, they were apparently not happy with the decision. Which makes sense. A lot of these developers were traditionally single-player developers being forced into a situation they weren't used to. That's the same reason why that Kill the Justice League game was not good. Among other reasons, Rocksteady was expected to make a game they weren't equipped to make. So if you look at the list of games that were being made here that were obviously bad ideas that got cancelled or might get cancelled, just imagine, if you will, a world where all these developers were instead making single-player games that they were interested in, where all this development time and money went to that instead. A world where nearly a dozen studios weren't hamstrung by idiotic corporate overlords without any foresight. Well, first of all, I don't envision Bungie making a non-live service game, so the two that they were making can be safely discounted. And obviously Helldivers 2 and Concord both came out, which leaves no less than 8 games that were being made or are currently being made that nobody asked for. And I don't think all 8 of those devs would have finished products if they were making single-player games instead of games as a service. A few of them probably would have been cancelled, but let's just say 6 of them came out. That would effectively double the amount of PlayStation exclusives that came out this generation. You think about that and you realize, remember how I mentioned the whole PlayStation has no games meme at the beginning of the video? For the past couple of years, I was under the assumption that the fact that PlayStation has had a sporadic first-party lineup at best, like a reverse Wii U, that it was entirely off the back of development now taking too long for them to be coming out consistently, but this showed me that no, that's actually not the case. PlayStation had the capabilities to be able to release upwards of 8 more separate exclusive games in addition to what they currently have. But instead, they chose to bank all their success on the hypothetical infinite money glitch that is live service gaming. And you don't need to be a genius to see where it all went downhill. They bet the entire generation on this and they failed. Ray Charles could have seen that this was a bad idea, and he doesn't even play video games. Now because of this, BluePoint is gone and who knows who's next. They wasted an entire generation for this. And it's not like we're halfway through the generation. Front to back, the 8th generation was 7 years. Meanwhile, Generation 9 began in late 2020. Think about it. And you know, I look at all this wasted time and money and I can't help but think about Japan Studio and how they were closed down for not being profitable enough. I'm sure the specifics are too complex for someone like me to understand, and the Lord knows they hadn't made anything that really interested me in a long time. But I'm also wondering if they even had the ability to do so. Obviously, things like Knack and Gravity Rush ended up being niche, but Japan Studio was also saddled with a bunch of VR stuff as well as Android and iOS slop. Meanwhile, back in the PS1 days, they took multiple years with a 100-person team to make Legend of Dragoon. They obviously didn't have that kind of support by the end, even though the PS4 was more successful than the PS1. But why couldn't they? They had the pedigree. It says to me that they could have been supported but weren't seen as worthy because once Sony decided to refocus their efforts into the primarily live service market, Japan Studio seemingly just didn't fit their vision. So they got the axe, and there was nothing that Japan Studio could have done about it. Of course, now that it didn't go their way, others are getting the axe. Sure, they got one successful game out of it in Helldivers 2, which is still being supported and still being played by a lot of people to this day, but then you had Concord. I already made a video on Concord because it's a game that fascinates me, but looking at the failure of Concord in the face of everything that they were attempting to do, I think Concord failing was the absolute best thing that could have happened. Like, it's not good that people are now facing layoffs, but at the very least, it should give Sony some level of pause. Because with their continued success since the PS4 came out, they've had every reason to be arrogant, and if nothing else, a high-profile failure like that should give them an indication that this attempted restructuring is bound for failure. So at the very least, it shouldn't be as big of an issue in the future. Hence, several of these games were cancelled after Concord flopped. Although Sony did announce a new live service game only a few months after Concord's failure, so I don't know what's up. Perhaps corporate hubris really is the thing that subverts any logic or sense. But still, Sony's catastrophic failure to cash in on this trend is indicative of the entire industry at this point. At this point, I treat the phrase live service game with the same attitude I treat the phrase 3-hour drive. I hate the fact that so much of the industry has found itself chasing this unicorn and sacrificed so much of their goodwill and potential release schedule on trying to make these live service games. This is entirely an attempt to gain money that so rarely works. How many big-time live service games have attempted to grab the zeitgeist and failed? A lot. Concord is obviously the big one, but at time of writing, the studio that made the live service skate game just had to lay off a bunch of their employees because the game is floundering. Also at time of writing, there was a recent release of a game called Highguard, which was announced at the Game Awards and was immediately derided as Concord 2, and while it had the right idea of being free to play and had a good day one, it dropped off a cliff after that. In fact, in the time it's taken for me to write these words down and speak into my microphone, the game announced its shutdown. I knew the game wasn't doing well, but I had no idea it was doing that bad. And then you have other such examples. Anybody remember Multiverses? Yeah, that was popular for about 2 seconds. Anthem is getting shut down because while it sold well, it failed to reach the cash flow it needed to make its money back. How about Babylon's Fall? A live service game that was such a massive failure, it was shut down in 6 months, which at the time was hilariously short. Then there's Skull and Bones, or what about that game about a certain squad killing the Justice League? It's failure after failure. These companies sink hundreds of millions of dollars into these grandiose attempts at never-ending games, only to have them fail one by one. And why is that? 'Cause nobody wants this shit. The reason why very few live service games actually succeed long-term is because the average person only has time for 1, maybe 2 live service games at a time. And much like MMOs of old, when somebody inevitably grows tired of trying out the new live service game, they're always going to gravitate back towards the one they like the most, which is probably the one they've been playing for months, if not years. That's the reason why Fortnite is still popular. Hell, my personal live service game of choice is Marvel Rivals. I've never even touched some of these games, even if they should hypothetically interest me. I would have gladly paid for an actual skate game because I love that series, but the moment I heard it was a live service, I lost all interest. But since most people only have time for 1 or 2 big live service games, there's only room for a couple of big games at the top, and everybody else wants to race to become the next big thing without realizing there's never going to be any room. The breakout hits are going to be very few and far between. The fact that Sony had 12 live service games in development with only one of them being successful so far, that's pretty indicative of the entire live service model. You're only going to get enough people to want to spend that much time on a game every so often. The market is well and truly more saturated than could ever reasonably support all these live service games to the point where it should be so obvious that there's no room to break through. But apparently nobody in these executive roles can recognize that, or they're too arrogant, assuming their idea is going to be the one to break through. I should specify that of the 12 games that were or are being made, including those that have come out, these don't include the live service games like MLB The Show or Gran Turismo 7. I don't count those, and neither do the lists that have compiled these games, as they have an entirely different audience from more gamey games. Now, I'm not one of those insufferable nerds who looks down on people who are obsessed with sports. I mean, I'm Canadian, I love hockey. But while there is some crossover, the audience that plays primarily sports games and driving games are much different and have different spending habits than those who play primarily core games. As far as the audience and development of more core games are concerned, I am eternally fascinated by the fact that these companies have to keep learning and relearning the same lessons. Every single year, it's the exact same story. Live service game after live service game flops, while you inevitably have several breakout single-player hits that grab the zeitgeist completely by accident. Like in 2025, it was Expedition 33, which I'm fully aware has become a bit of a divisive game recently on account of the fact that it was perhaps overpraised, and when you overpraise something, inevitably you're gonna get pushback. But when you think about it, that was a Cinderella story. It was a unique product with a unique vision that was made for a reasonable amount of money by a team of passionate professionals, and it resonated with the audience and sold more copies than they probably could have ever imagined. Not every game can be that lucky, but there's a reason why the breakout hit of the year is almost always a single-player game. Because the audience who plays live service games have already found their games more often than not. The audience actually wanting to play new single-player games are the ones buying multiple games per year. Even if you don't like Expedition 33, there were 2 other successful independently funded games that represent each level of independent game development, and are each wildly successful. BluePoint was a game made by one guy and sold 2 million copies. Hollow Knight Silksong broke Steam briefly. Look at that, you have a big studio indie game otherwise known as a AA game in Expedition 33, a small studio indie game with Silksong, and a solo developed indie game in BluePoint. all in the same year, all garnering a similar level of acclaim. And when you look back at the year that was, you can't help but notice the trend that most games that were highly publicized and sold well were mostly primarily single-player experiences. Kingdom Come: Deliverance 2, Donkey Kong Bonanza, the Elden Ring standalone expansion Night Rain, Death Stranding 2, I can go on. Even things that were less successful, like Silent Hill F, was still extremely successful by the standards of the series it's part of. And you can go back to any given year over the past decade, maybe, and it's the same story every year. In 2024, for example, the critical and commercial darling was probably Astro Bot, and I'm not even the biggest fan of Astro Bot, but I still consider it a positive step forward in a lot of ways. Like E33, it was a well-designed game made by a small team of passionate creators with a reasonable development cost that came out, charmed audiences everywhere, and sold a good amount of copies. The only negative thing I have to say about the game is the fact that I wish it had more of a unique identity all its own rather than being member berries the game. It's been proven time and again that audiences that are actually buying games on a regular basis just want well-made single-player games. As a matter of fact, while this will date the video, we're not even a quarter of the way through 2026 and we've already had yet another prime example of showing what audiences want. At time of writing, Resident Evil Requiem just came out and it broke the record for most concurrent players on Steam in the history of Resident Evil. That includes the remakes of the most beloved games in the series, possibly of all time. And the sad fact is, Sony, more than any other company in the gaming industry, should understand this. They should be the ones most willing to make single-player games. Why is that? Because what have been the most successful games under the PlayStation banner, almost without fail? Single-player, narrative-driven, action games. That has been their bread and butter since Uncharted 1. Like, how hard is it to make games for your audience? Nintendo understands this, and despite any issues, they're killing it right now, and I'm not even a fan of Nintendo's current output. I can admit that me not vibing with their output is entirely on me. Like, I cannot contain my absolute contempt and bafflement at the idea that they thought a God of War live service game would be a good idea. God of War is my favorite franchise, and you know what would have happened if that game came out? I would have played it for a few hours, I would have made a video on it, and I would have never touched it again. Guaranteed. Because as a God of War fan, I'm not interested in that. That's not something I've ever come to the series for. It reminds me of back when multiplayer modes became a big thing in games, so suddenly almost every game had to include a multiplayer mode no matter how superfluous. People apparently have fond memories of, for example, the God of War Ascension multiplayer, but it still died within a couple of months because, well, that's not what most God of War players come to the series for. Many such cases. So this whole situation is like that, except blowing it up to an absolute extreme. So congratulations, Sony, you wasted hundreds of millions of dollars and an entire console generation and you have almost nothing to show for it. Do I still consider myself more of a fan of the PlayStation brand compared to other options on the market? I would say so, yeah. But at this moment in time, I'm more of a fan of their legacy content than I am of their current output. Do I think in a vacuum the PlayStation 5 is a good piece of hardware? Yeah, I think it's a solid console for what it is. But Sony's handling of the PlayStation 5 has been among some of the worst I've ever seen. They've earned every single one of those no games jokes. I'm not sure how common this sentiment is among people outside of the internet. I guarantee it's a sentiment that's popular on the internet, but those are two very different worlds. The PlayStation 3 initially flopped hard because of its restrictive price point. The fact that it had no games was entirely down to its difficult hardware. And it was exacerbated by the lack of player base, making early third-party titles non-viable. But there is a part of me that believes that this generation has resulted in a hit to the goodwill among their audience, and I think that will result in the sales taking a hit in the next generation. And if that does come to pass, Sony's cynical attempt at trying for the real-life infinite money glitch is the reason why it might just happen. Even for me, somebody who's traditionally been a PlayStation fan, it will take a hell of a reason for me to want to buy a PlayStation 6 at this point with how badly they've burnt me. I'll have even less of a reason if they end up doing simultaneous PS5 releases like they did with the PS4 this generation. Am I confident in saying that this is the worst generation in the history of PlayStation? And this is the sole reason? You know what? Yeah, I am. There's nothing wrong with having games be supported post-launch. Look at Monster Hunter Wilds. That's not a live service game, but it's still supported like one. So yeah, if a game is successful, support it. Give content updates. Give DLC. Just for the love of God, know your audience. And to the gaming industry as a whole, for f***'s sakes, I just want good single-player games. But I guess treating your customers like people instead of wallets on legs is apparently alien to a lot of money-grubbing publishers who will never not believe that they're going to be the exception. That's all I've got. If you like this video and want to support the channel, you can leave a like, subscribe, tell me what you think in the comments section, and hit the notification icon so you're always up to date on what I'm doing. I've been the King of Snark Style right here on Tactical Bacon Productions, and I will see you next time. Stay crispy, my friends.